Today we have Gary Davis, speaker and author of the book Networking in the South. It's great to have you on the show, Gary.
Thanks, Martin. Excited to be here.
Well, I want to know why networking in the South. I mean, there are hundreds of networking books. Why that topic?
Well, I started out recounting my experiences on networking and quickly realized that there was a particular flair to this region. There was a particular way of being that people from here had, and people who were not from here took a while to assimilate to. And I started looking at the history as a history teacher and trained educator. I remembered learning about the backgrounds of both the North and the South. And I saw that the agrarian economy of the South and the more industrialized factory economy of the North caused some of the conflict. You know, people here were used to going a little slower, watching for the weather to be nice, to grow the crops, asking for help from the farms nearby. Whereas in the Industrial Revolution, the North was mainly a group of factories where people were involved in exactly what was in front of them and being as quick as they can to make as much money as they can. There was very little cooperation. And in fact, cooperation might lead for you to make less money. And so that background permeated into a couple of generations later a way of being where you go into some of the places where people maybe aren't as open and as friendly, and there's a thing called Southern hospitality. It's not a made-up thing. It actually exists. And I started looking at, well, how does that affect networking? How does it affect relationships? And I saw that people sometimes had an easy time when they moved here selling things, because sales is sales. And in fact, moving a little faster and being a little more direct actually might work better if you're selling. But if the conversation you're having is relationship building and you're selling, then you might not build relationship. And I saw that there was a need to kind of explain how people in the South are and give people who were moving here maybe a better sense of what they recognize over time. As they live here, they kind of get it. But this was a way for people to say, hey, read this book and you'll see some stuff that 3 years from now you'll notice it, but you don't have to take 3 years to figure out why it's that way.
What type of advice would you give someone that's moving from New York City to Raleigh, North Carolina, or even better to Fuquay, Varina?
Well, I try not to give people too many tips and tricks because I don't think they work that well. But the one thing that I would be cognizant of if I was moving here from out of town that I think would take you the farthest is that it's okay to be who you are. When we have this conversation about networking in the South, it's not a moral conversation that we're saying the way we are is a better way to be and the way you are is bad. It's not a good, bad dichotomy. It's more, there's a way to be down here that really works better. So you can be who you are, but you need to notice how other people are being when you're here.
You mean I can be a Yankee when I come down here and that would work out?
Absolutely. There's a way of being that a Yankee, as we say, is, that's fine as long as you notice the people that are moving not the way you're moving. So if you want to move quickly, so people from the North oftentimes do business in a little faster fashion. You need to notice, are you tracking with the people you're doing business with? More importantly, when you're building a relationship, you can't be efficient with people. You can't work quickly to build a relationship. Relationships are built over time, and that's something that people in the South have realized for years. And there's an element of distrust in the South of people coming from other places because of our history. I mean, if you look at it, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be this way, but we were a country and we were invaded, and the people that invaded, put our government in jail and changed our money, and albeit a very short time frame, the Confederate States of America did exist. And although it's silly to talk about the Civil War in 2008, there are people whose grandparents talked about what happened to their parents, and it's instilled in them that people from other places are not to be trusted. So you move down here, we move more slowly, and we trust a little slower, so you've already got a couple of strikes against you.
Gary, you bring up some interesting ideas, and as a young man raised in D.C. with a father from Allentown, Pennsylvania, and a mother from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, I really learned from my mother of what a deep effect the Civil War had on her family and the history.
It was to a lot of folks that are people who raised the people who you're trying to meet. And so it's in their background. I think another generation, it'll be even less so. I'm 42 years old, and I don't know that my children will be having those kind of conversations, but I know that my parents did, and I know that we do. And the fact of the matter is that the tip is don't try to be from here if you're not from here, but be authentic, about who you are, and notice how the people that already are here are moving. We move a little slower. We trust a little slower. We're a little more open to things, I think, and we're ready to accept, and we are very tolerant. And yet there's a conversation about intolerance. So be careful about the conversations you have and notice who you're speaking to and what you're speaking into.
When people come down here and I start talking to them or coaching them, one of the concepts that's most important I found was small talk. And I want you to explain why is that so important, because I've truly learned its value.
Well, the thing about small talk is that it does take time, and many people that are not from here don't want to take the time. They want to cut to the chase. Well, the thing is that there's no chase down here. We're not chasing anything. We're trying to get to know you. And people are afraid of each other. I mean, the reason people shake hands is because long, long ago, you put your right hand out to show you didn't have a weapon. And then you shook hands, and I knew you weren't going to conk me over the head. Although nobody's going to probably conk you over the head at a chamber mixer, the fact of the matter is people are still scared of one another. But small talk gives you a few minutes to kind of look at somebody's eyes, notice their smile, get used to them, and be with somebody before what you're talking about actually matters. I had a guy one time that said he wanted to do a little small talk, and he said he'd come up with a question he was going to use to, start conversations. And I asked him what he was going to use, and he said, well, I'm going to ask people what's keeping them up at night. That's not small talk.
No, that's scary talk.
Yeah, that's therapist talk. I mean, that's not the kind of thing people really want to divulge, especially at a little chamber mixer holding a little cocktail weenie plate and a little drink. And they're like, what do you mean what keeps me up at night? I mean, what would have been more appropriate might be hot enough for you.
Why do they talk about stories so much here?
Well, I think that it comes from that Southern tradition of sitting out on the front porch and that oral tradition of passing down the history through stories. You go all the way back to, Song of the South and the Aesop's, fables that were then turned into Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. And we go up through time and we see people using the story about this thing that happened or that thing that happened to explain how people should move or what people should do. It's a part, I think, sense of humor. I mean, it's a part of being able to have fun. And it's been a lot of suffering in the South. Obviously, there's been suffering everywhere, but one of the things that had people suffer less was their ability to entertain each other with stories of what had happened, and then those stories get passed down to the next group to kind of talk about how you learned this lesson or what you should do. And so when you hear a Southern speaker, a lot of times a Southern speaker will use stories to make their points.
This might seem unusual, but some of the Northerners I've worked with have been a little uncomfortable with the fact of people waving at them and being nice to them when they first met them. How would you explain that?
Yeah, waving's a problem. Waving's a big deal because, and even if you're from here sometimes, you kind of get weird about it. Because like the third time you walk by somebody at work and you've already walked by them twice and you've already said hey to them, you might think, well, do I really need to say hey again? And you do. Because if you don't, then somebody might walk away from that and go, what's wrong with Martin? Yeah. I wonder why he didn't speak. Make sure you speak. And if you live in a neighborhood and you wave at people, the people from here are used to waving back. And they're used to you waving at them, and it's very normal. So you come into a world where people really do interact. I'll tell you the truth, it's not, and I don't want to say it's not friendly, but it's really not personal. It's more automatic. The fact that when you walk by somebody in New York and you look down at the sidewalk, is
or
just
straight ahead.
Or straight ahead is just as automatic as the fact when you walk down the street here and you see somebody that you bob your head at them. It's not something you're really doing for them. It's just what we do.
For salespeople, what's some advice if you were a salesperson, you were highly successful in New York City, and you're coming here? What advice would you give them?
Well, ultimately, the good news is that the mechanics of a sale are not that different. The relationship building piece, when you talk about building rapport, a lot of times building rapport and networking have a lot in common. But a sale is when you're making an offer and you're trying to get an accept or a decline, and you're trying to get an accept, not a decline, and you need to get it as quickly as possible because you need to make your numbers and you need to report whether or not you're going to make your numbers. That sound like sales? Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much everywhere. Sales is going to be pretty similar, and people expect a little more forthrightness. People expect you to make a decision. What you may find down here is that people are less apt to make a decision covertly. They do it, they're more willing to make a decision overtly, where they say we're thinking about it when they're not. Mm-hmm. They say we're looking at it when they're not, because they don't want to say no, because they don't want to hurt your feelings. So instead of hurting your feelings, they just string you along for a long, long time. People do that same thing with networking. You meet somebody and they say, hey, let's get together. And somebody says, yeah, that sounds good. And then 3 months later, you guys are still trying to find a time to get together. At least one of you is.
That sounds a little bit like the Japanese traditional way of doing business. If they didn't want the product, they'd say, let's have tea.
Yes.
And it was understood. But it was understood. It wasn't impolite or rude.
Most like when a parent says maybe.
Uh-huh.
And some children know that maybe means no.
Another piece I've seen is demanding that they get a no. And I want you to talk about this, because I've seen a lot of train wrecks occurring where the salesperson go, well, I'm going to go for it till I get a no.
Well, and you use the word train wreck. The reason is because of training, because people are trained to get a no. Mm-hmm. They go to training and the trainer explains to them that until they get a no, they should keep going and da-da-da. And then they come down here and they insist on getting a no. And if you're a transaction person dealing with people who you'll never deal with again and they'll never know anybody you deal with, that's fine. But like, when is that ever going to happen?
Right.
The better way to move would be, continue to keep up with someone until you get the sense that it is a no, and then maybe walk away. Now, at the end of the day, you may walk away from a deal that you could have gotten. So this advice is taken not lightly. You don't walk away just because someone says no. But know that you also may annoy people. And you know what the bad news is? You don't really get to know. Sales is a funny thing, because you go to sales training and there's a belief in sales training that every sale could have been gotten if someone had done the right things. And the fact of the matter is, sometimes you just aren't going to win. And there isn't anything else you could have done. Same way with networking. There are people who you might try to connect with that just don't connect with you. And there isn't a tip or a trick in the book that's going to have you connect with them.
Well, what you're saying to me is, basically, if you knock 3 times and they don't respond, it might be wise to just assume they're not interested. If they don't take an action on what you say, you might want to start reading that as put it on hold.
Yeah, I want to be careful that I don't discourage people from being persistent. Mm-hmm. But being persistent may create a certain identity for you. The fact of the matter is that salespeople already have that identity, right? We're already the pushy salesperson. Mm-hmm. Pushy goes with salesperson, not patient. You don't hear about people talking about he's as patient as a salesperson. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, that pushy salesperson may make more money because they keep showing up. And of the 10 places that said no and meant no, there may be an 11th that said no and eventually said yes. I mean, you hear the story all the time about people getting 100 no's. But they get 100 no's and they get a yes from one person. The other 100 people they call and get 100 no's from is really upset and wonders why they won't just leave them alone.
How is this useful for somebody in another area of the country?
Well, the fact of the matter is that networking in the South and the conversation around how to fit in the South is helpful if you come here because we're all moving that way and it'll help you get related more quickly. But the other thing that's important to notice is the way we move in the South is actually more conducive to building long-term relationships. Being careful with people, being cautious, spending time getting to know someone, that is something that's going to work anywhere you go, and especially might work well in a place where other people aren't doing it. Mm-hmm. So if you take some of the tenets from networking in the South about moving a little more slowly, being a scholar in the world of small talk, taking time to get to know people. If you go somewhere where people aren't doing that, you may find that it helps you to build deeper relationships than other people. Just like people who come from other places might come here and their sales skills where they came from work even better here because they run all over everybody and push everybody around and sometimes get the contract because of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I thought was so valuable with your book and your talk is you paint a picture of the South that lets someone step into it to start understanding more who they're speaking to and how they're relating. And it's sort of like if you were going into very hot weather, it'd be nice to have a picture of what hot weather would look like if you hadn't experienced it. And then you would know how to be appropriate there. And that's, to me, what you're doing you tell stories in your talks, you tell stories in your book, but you also give some ways to operate with people.
Well, that's what I hear again and again from someone who has moved here and has been here for a while and then picks up a copy of my book and reads it. What the common denominator I get back is, gosh, I wish I had read this 3 years ago. But, I kind of know a lot of this now, and you're right. And some of it, I knew that people were being a certain way, but until I read the book, I didn't know why. And now that I know why, I have better access to moving with those people. So it's just like if you get a cold. You don't really know where you got the cold from, right? You're walking around, you're shaking a lot of hands, you're talking to a lot of people. So in order to avoid a cold next time, you don't really know what to do. I mean, you wash your hands, certain things you can do. But when you put your hand on the eye of a stove, your hand gets really burnt. Well, you know why that happened, so you know not to do that again. In the South, if you notice how people are doing, that's kind of like getting a cold. You kind of notice what they're doing, but you can't really figure it out. But if you know why they're doing what they're doing, it's more like the eye of the stove, because now you can really tell, it's also going to be true, not just on the eye of a stove, it's also going to be true in a fire. It's also going to be true of a pot that sits on the stove. You can start making some assessments that if you didn't know why it burns you, you couldn't make them. Same way, if you notice that people are a little more distrustful, but you don't know why, then you don't have as much access to power around how to move with them.
One thing I've noticed is that people in the South, an important piece is to understand your family, what church you go to, and other aspects. Why is that so important, and how does that relate to business?
Well, first, I have to speak only from my own experience, which is as a white guy in the South. Mm-hmm. And when I say a white guy in the South, a lot of people identify themselves as Italian or Irish. You have Irish bars full of people who are all wearing Irish shirts with Irish flags. And then you have people who identify very strongly with their Scottish heritage. And most of the people who identify with those types of heritages are people from other parts of the country, because most of the people in the South, or I'd say a large group of the people in the South, their people came over on boats, like the first boats. Mm-hmm. So they came a long time ago. And the Scots and the Irish and the English, they weren't that particular about who they married and had children with. So 7, 8 generations later, I'm not Irish or Scottish or English or I don't know what I am, just a white guy, right? And white guys and white gals identify themselves much more strongly with the area they live in. So if you're from Johnston County and your people are from Johnston County going back, then you're from Johnston County. The interesting thing is people sometimes will move here and they'll live here, 20 years, and they'll say, well, I'm not from here, but it's like I'm from here because I've been here for 20 years. It ain't very bit like you from here. You are not from here. Now, there's nothing wrong with not being from here, but the fact of the matter is that if you're not from here you're not from here. And if your mom and daddy aren't from here, you're just barely from here. Because you grew up in a house with all the traditions from where your parents came from, eating the food they ate, speaking the way they spoke. You go to school, you come home, you say y'all, your mama falls out on the floor. Mm-hmm. So the fact of the matter is that you cannot be from here and be a very effective networker, but if you're not from here, you're never going to be from here. And if you get away from the areas like Raleigh and you get out into the Pender County and the Johnston County and Nash County, then you actually aren't from here if your grandparents aren't from here, because you're still thought of as somebody that moved from somewhere else. Even if you're from Roxborough, you're not from Fuquay. There is a conversation down here that you don't hear as much, I think, in some other areas of the country, which is people ask you where you go to church, as if you go to church. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to go to church. It isn't a conversation about trying to convert you, but just know that that's something that down here can tell me something about you. Do you go to a Duncan church, or do you go to a Sprinkling church? You need to go to a church that has a literal interpretation of the Bible, or do you go to one of those churches that doesn't believe in Adam and Eve? And you know about people a little bit, and you can move with them effectively with who they are. And, the fact of the matter is that people who aren't from here, sometimes they don't even know what all that means.
What about the weather? Why is the weather so important?
Well, we love the weather down here, and I hope you love the weather too. But the weather really defined how well things would go for people. So again, going back to the conversation about in the north, you were in a factory. If it was raining, if it was snowing, if it was whatever, you still put that little piece onto that little thing, and then it went down the line, and you got the next one, and you did that again. If you were working in a coal mine, you were working in the coal mine. You were down there. You were doing your thing. The weather didn't matter. Here, if it doesn't rain, it's a bad thing. When it rains, boy, the Lord's good to us. Look at this beautiful rain we're getting. When the sun's shining, oh, look at this beautiful day we're getting. The sun's looking in. We can really get out and work today. The sun's shining. We can get some stuff done. And so there was a conversation. Again, we're talking about a couple of generations ago when the weather really, today we're all working in office buildings. Mm-hmm. It's all the same thing. Now, the other thing I'll say about the weather, which is a completely different tact, is that the weather fits into the small talk formula that I teach perfectly. Small talk needs to be about something everybody knows about. That's the weather, right? Everybody knows what's going on with the weather. Everyone has some opinion about it without having to think about it. I mean, if it's hot enough for you. It's always hot enough for me. I'm a big boy and I sweat. And so if you ask me if it's hot enough for me, the answer is yes. You don't have to go, well, I don't know. Let me check. Or let me get back with you. You just know, right? So everybody knows about it, and everyone has some opinion about it. And then the third thing, and this is really important, is it can't matter. And it can't be scary.
So say a little more on that.
If it matters, then it's not small talk. Uh-huh. Like my friend who asked the question, what's keeping you up at night? Yeah. Well, that's not a conversation I'm ready to have with you. It's not that I won't have that conversation with you. I just may not be ready for it. Uh-huh. And you won't believe, if you're not a student of small talk, how many times a simple question about what you're doing this weekend can turn into a conversation about how to help someone's teenage alcoholic son.
One of the things about small talk is it lets me slow down so I can really get a sense of the person and start trusting my own intuition about them. If I move too quickly, then I'll miss subtle clues.
Well, absolutely. It gives you time to notice who they are, notice what they say in small talk or what they decide to talk about in small talk, and notice if they'll let you talk or if they're just going to talk about everything that matters to them. And the other thing I wanted to mention about small talk, and this is crucial, and some of you out there, you know who you are. This is what you do. Small talk should never be scary. Now, I don't mean like scary, like the thing where I say, what's keeping you up at night, but I mean like some people, what they want to have small talk about is the fact that there was a police officer that was killed in the mountains last night. He pulled up somebody, he was shot twice, he's dead, they got the guy. And then today, after that news comes out, people walk around, did you hear about that guy that got killed? So I don't want to talk about that guy that got killed. Did you hear about the Virginia Tech massacre? Did you hear about, whatever? It's like, I don't want to talk about that. And some people, that's where they go, and it's because they don't know where else to go.
You said something that I thought was very important called not one-upping people. I really want you to say something about that, because that's something people can be doing and not even notice it.
Well, I call them toppers, and if you don't know a topper, you are a topper. So a topper is someone who, no matter what you've done, they've done it better and twice. So you tell them, I love to go scuba diving, and they tell you, well, my grandfather invented scuba diving. And the fact of the matter is that they're not doing it to be bad. But we don't like it. It's annoying. None of us like it. But in their mind, they're thinking, hey, this person likes scuba diving, and my grandfather invented scuba diving. So when I tell them this, they're going to love it. Do we love it? No, we don't love it. But they still do it to get related. So the purpose behind what they're doing is very admirable. They're trying to get related. But what would be more appropriate in that exact conversation might be if I say I like scuba diving, to say, oh, I do too. Where do you like to go? And then I tell you, oh, you like the Bahamas. What do you like about the Bahamas? And I tell you, and I tell you, and I tell you. And at some point, if I am someone also who is a good networker, I'm going to say, so what got you interested in scuba diving? Now might be an appropriate time to say, well, it turns out that my grandfather was involved in the creation of scuba diving. So now you're not a topper because you took some time to learn about my interests first. And guess what? That is pretty interesting if I'm a scuba diver to know the person who's kin to the person who invented it, right?
There's a piece you talk about in one of your speeches, and it's busting your chops. I just want you to talk about that. I thought that was hilarious and informative.
Well, I tell a real fun story about a friend of mine who was from South Philly. And obviously, people in South Philly have a different way of moving with each other that is appropriate there, but maybe not appropriate here. And won't do the whole thing, but on this particular day, I had gotten a haircut, and I was real proud because I'd spent a lot of money on the haircut, more than I did, when I was in Fuquay. I was now in college in Chapel Hill, and I got a hairdresser. Never had a hairdresser before. So I saw my buddy, and he looked at me, and he said, hey, you get a free steak with that haircut. And, frankly, I wondered if you could get a free steak with a haircut, because I didn't know people don't do that kind of thing where I grew up. And I said, no, I didn't get a free steak. Where do you go get a haircut when you get a free steak? And he looked at me just as innocent as he could, and he said, Gary, I was just busting your chops.
Right.
And busting your chops is not a Southern way of moving. Mm-hmm. Cutting people down is not something that we do a lot of, and especially your mama. Don't talk about somebody's mama down here, because that'd be the last thing you might say. Not that in business you're going to talk about somebody's mama, but to just rib people and to make people look bad in front of a group and ridicule and embarrass someone might be fun in some places, but down here, not only is the person you're doing it to not going to really enjoy that, but the people around them are going to be like, why are you doing that?
One of the things going to St. Andrews in Laurinburg, North Carolina, I learned when I finally got to know some of the people that lived there, is the generosity that occurred after I made an effort to really get to know them. I want you to talk about that, because that's something I truly love about the South.
Well, there is a thing called Southern hospitality that gets a lot of press, and nobody's not heard of it. But what I think that people that move here find is that it really does exist, and that there really is a notion that if you're someone who is interested in me, I'm going to be real interested in you. And it stems from that agrarian society where we needed help. And when you got help, you took care of the people who helped you. You took good care of them. In fact, you tried to take better care of them than they took care of you.
Like what was it, the chipmunks?
Yeah, after you. I mean, there's a thing down here called the after you syndrome that some of the Northerners sometimes fall into. You ever hear somebody after you, no after you, no after you? That's the chipmunks do that. But there's also, we do that here, and sometimes someone that's not from here, you say after you, and they just walk on through. And sometimes after you means after you, but sometimes after you means after you. Now you say after me, now I go. And if you don't play the game, you don't know when after you means after me. Now that's not literal. When somebody opens the door and says after you, they don't really mean they want to go first. But it is a lot of places. There are a lot of places in business where we're being nice and we can't believe you took us up on it. And we don't say anything. We just smile. But there is an assessment that gets made in that moment that may get shared with somebody else.
Right.
And it may sound like, oh, yeah, bless his heart, he just doesn't get it.
In your talk, you talk about willingness. I want you to speak about that briefly.
Well, Martin, I told you we tell stories sometimes to make a point. And the willingness, I think about Mr. John and Miss Grace. And Miss Grace was 80 and Miss John was 85. And when Miss Grace was a young lass, she was a looker, and everybody wanted Miss Grace. And Mr. John knew how lucky he was to get her and lived his whole life taking care of her. And on a particular day, we were out in the yard, and down here a lot of times we'll have rocks in the ground, and you'll have a rock that comes out of the ground and you can see it. Then sometimes there'll be a rock that's kind of even with the ground, and it's like 3 or 4 feet of rock, but you know underneath that rock is a boulder that is 10 times as big as the rock you can see. And I was talking to Mr. John about how he kept Miss Grace happy, because anybody's been married that long might have some good ideas. And he looked at me, he said, you know something, Gary? Miss Grace came out here right now and said for me to dig that rock up, I'd go get the shovel. And I said, well, Miss John, you could never dig that rock up, no matter how hard you tried. He said, well, there's 2 things I'll tell you about that. The good news is that if I tried to dig that rock up, then Miss Grace will know she's married to someone who would try. And as old as I am, I'll be dead before she finds out I can't do it. So sometimes willingness is the offer. Sometimes saying, I'll help, even if you don't know how you're going to, may be as important to somebody as actually being able to do the thing that they need to get done. And you may surprise yourself.
Well, you know, what I've learned is good people don't take advantage of that.
That's right. The people you want to be networking with are not users. And that's the conversation about assessments. You know, I talk about assessments versus judgments. You know, people say, I don't want to make a judgment. Well, last time that somebody made a judgment on me, it was a judge. Because judgments actually involve penalties, and this is how it's going to go. Assessments, you're making assessments all the time. You don't get to choose whether to make assessments. You're already doing it. So in networking, I think the more important thing than making assessments, because you're already making assessments, is notice your assessments and then find evidence that your assessments are true. And if you can find evidence that your assessment that someone is a user, then that's not someone that you should be willing to accept their request.
Or someone who never asks you about scuba diving.
Well, it is interesting. It's hard to tell who's who, and that goes back to the conversation about networking takes time.
This has been really enjoyable, Gary. How can people learn more about it? You have a book, and you have a number of talks and trainings.
Well, I've got a website you can go to, GaryDavisPresents.com, and then the site for my book is networkinginthesouth.com, where you can get a copy of the book. We do also have 2 CDs. One is a talk about networking in the South, which is not, people ask, what's the difference between the book and the CD? And I tell them the book's a book and the CD's a talk. So there's things in the talk that aren't in the book, and it's things in the book that aren't in the talk. Then I have another CD that is really a conversation about selfish altruism and how networking for people works better than networking with people. And it's not a regional conversation. This is one that really talks about the universal way that human beings move with each other.
Well, thanks for coming. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Mike. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Inquire Online, where unique questions inspire new answers. To learn about other shows, go to inquireonline.info.